The coldest day of winter was the day Michael Carter lost everything. By noon, he had been fired from the factory where he had worked faithfully for 11 years. By evening, he had only $23 left in his wallet, an overdue rent notice waiting at home, and an 8-year-old daughter named Grace depending on him to somehow make tomorrow better than today. Yet before the sun disappeared behind the snow-covered streets of Silver Pine, Colorado, Michael made one decision that seemed impossible. He gave away the last warm meal he could afford to a trembling elderly woman sitting alone in a small roadside cafe. He believed it was simply the right thing to do. He had no idea that this single act of compassion would set in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. Before we continue this unforgettable story, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who still believes kindness can change lives, and subscribe to the channel if you believe second chances still exist in this world. Stories like this remind us that even the smallest act of love can create the greatest miracle. Michael had never imagined that one ordinary Tuesday would erase years of hard work. The factory announced sudden layoffs after losing several major contracts. His supervisor handed him a thin envelope, offered a quick apology, and quietly looked away. There was no celebration of loyalty, no thank you for working weekends, no recognition of the sacrifices he had made after his wife, Rachel, passed away from cancer 3 years earlier. Michael walked out carrying a cardboard box filled with family photos, an old coffee mug, and the heavy feeling that he had somehow failed his little girl. Grace waited patiently every afternoon at her neighbor Mrs. Thompson's house until Michael finished work. She was bright, cheerful, and wise beyond her years, but even she noticed the sadness in her father's eyes that evening. Michael forced a smile, hugged her tightly, and promised that everything would be okay. Deep inside, however, he had no idea how they would survive the coming weeks. Their savings had already disappeared paying hospital bills before Rachel passed away. Every paycheck since then had barely covered rent, groceries, utilities, and Grace's school supplies. Instead of going straight home, Michael stopped at the Copper Lantern Cafe. He counted the money in his wallet several times before ordering one bowl of hot chicken soup and a plate of bread. His plan was simple. He and Grace would split the meal for dinner, and tomorrow he would begin searching for another job. As Michael waited, he noticed an elderly woman sitting near the window. Her gray coat looked far too thin for the freezing weather, and her hands trembled as she wrapped them around an empty cup of coffee. Her silver hair was neatly combed despite the snow melting on her shoulders, and there was a quiet dignity about her that seemed strangely out of place. The waitress eventually approached her table with an embarrassed expression. The woman gently nodded, gathered her worn handbag, and slowly stood to leave because she couldn't afford even the cheapest meal. Michael felt something tighten inside his chest. He thought about Grace waiting for him, about the rent due in 5 days, and about the uncertainty ahead. Every logical thought told him to stay silent. But another voice, the one Rachel always admired, reminded him that kindness mattered most when it cost something. Without hesitation, Michael carried his own meal to the elderly woman's table. He placed the warm bowl before her and quietly encouraged her to eat while it was still hot. Grace, watching her father, smiled softly and slid the basket of bread closer to the woman without saying a word. The elderly lady's tired eyes filled with tears. She accepted the meal with overwhelming gratitude, as though it was worth far more than food. Around the cafe, several customers watched silently. Some seemed surprised. Others lowered their heads, realizing they had ignored the same woman only moments earlier. Even the waitress quietly wiped away tears before bringing an extra cup of coffee to the table at no charge. The woman introduced herself simply as Margaret Bennett. She spoke gently about difficult seasons in life and thanked Michael for reminding her that kindness still existed. Michael never asked why she was alone or how she had fallen into such circumstances. He believed every person deserved dignity without having to explain their pain. That evening, Michael and Grace returned home with empty stomachs but peaceful hearts. Grace quietly prepared peanut butter crackers for dinner using the last slices of bread in the kitchen. Before going to bed, she told her father that Mommy would have been proud of him. Those simple words became the only comfort Michael carried into another sleepless night. The next morning brought more disappointment. Every business he visited had already filled open positions. Bills continued arriving faster than opportunities. 3 days later, the landlord reminded Michael that eviction proceedings would begin if rent remained unpaid by the end of the week. Then something unexpected happened. A black luxury SUV stopped outside Michael's modest apartment building. 2 professionally dressed individuals stepped out and politely asked if they could speak with him. Michael assumed there had been some mistake. Instead, they introduced themselves as representatives of the Bennett Family Foundation and requested that he accompany them to an office downtown. Confused but curious, Michael accepted. The office occupied the top floor of one of Denver's tallest buildings. Elegant artwork decorated the walls, and employees greeted the visitors with quiet respect. Moments later, Michael entered a spacious conference room where the elderly woman from the cafe stood waiting. Except she no longer looked helpless. She wore an elegant navy suit, carried herself with confidence, and was surrounded by respected executives who treated her with extraordinary admiration. Margaret Bennett smiled warmly as Michael recognized her. She explained that she was not homeless at all. She was one of America's wealthiest philanthropists, having built a nationwide logistics company after decades of determination and sacrifice alongside her late husband. Despite enormous success, Margaret regularly traveled anonymously to understand how ordinary people treated strangers when there was nothing to gain. Most people ignored her. Some mocked her. Others pretended not to notice. Michael had been different. He gave away the only meal he could afford while believing she could never repay him. Margaret admitted that his kindness had moved everyone involved in the quiet social experiment, including members of her foundation observing nearby. But she made something very clear. She wasn't rewarding charity. She was investing in character. Before offering any assistance, Margaret had quietly verified Michael's background. Former co-workers described him as dependable and honest. Teachers praised his devotion to grace. Neighbors spoke about the countless times he had helped elderly residents shovel snow without accepting payment. His compassion wasn't a performance. It was his way of living. Margaret offered Michael something far greater than money. She invited him to become Director of Community Outreach for the Bennett Family Foundation, overseeing employment programs designed to help struggling single parents rebuild their lives. The position came with an excellent salary, health insurance, housing assistance, and educational opportunities for Grace. Michael could hardly believe what he was hearing. Tears filled his eyes as years of exhaustion finally broke free. He accepted the opportunity with profound gratitude, not because it promised wealth, but because it allowed him to help families facing struggles he understood personally. Months passed. Michael transformed the foundation's employment initiative into one of the nation's most successful job placement programs. Hundreds of struggling parents found meaningful work, childcare assistance, financial education, and renewed hope. Every decision he made reflected the compassion born from his own hardships. Grace flourished as well. She excelled in school, volunteered alongside her father during community events, and often reminded people that the greatest gifts were the ones shared with strangers. Margaret became like family to them. She attended Grace's school performances, celebrated birthdays, and often said that Michael had restored something wealth alone could never buy, her faith in humanity. One snowy evening, nearly a year after their first meeting, Michael returned to the same Copper Lantern Cafe with Grace and Margaret. They quietly paid for every meal served that night, asking the staff to simply tell customers that someone believed they mattered. No names. No photographs. No publicity. Just kindness continuing its journey. As people smiled in surprise, Michael remembered the day he thought his life had ended. Losing his job had felt like the greatest tragedy imaginable. Looking back, he realized it had simply been the painful beginning of a better chapter God had already prepared. If this story touched your heart, please support the channel by liking this video, sharing it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribing so more people can discover stories that remind us goodness still exists in the world. Before this story ends, tell us in the comments, what would you have done if your last meal was all you had left? Michael eventually understood that generosity is never measured by how much we give. It is measured by what we choose to share when giving costs us the most. His final meal became the first step toward a future he never imagined, proving that compassion has a way of returning when least expected. Sometimes the people we help are far more powerful than we know. More importantly, every act of kindness transforms the person giving it long before it changes the person receiving it. And in a world that often rewards wealth, status, and success, it is still an honest heart that leaves the greatest legacy of all.